The case of Anthony Dixon is yet another example of how deeply the past can scar the present. He was raised amidst severe trauma and chaos, in a childhood that was anything but normal. As his life spiraled into paranoia and drug addiction, he trapped others in his web of chaos. After that, there was only one way for his story to go: complete devastation. The 21st of January 2003 started off like any other for Renee Gumby. At 25 years old, she was finally looking forward to the future. Life hadn't always been kind to Renee, but there was hope that sometime soon her luck would change. 4 months earlier, in October 2002, she had escaped a violent relationship. Her ex-partner was a gang member who forced her to cook and deal methamphetamine to fund his own habit. Renee was also the primary target of his drug-fueled rages. It was when she was at her lowest point that she met the man who changed her life forever, but sadly, not in a good way. Anthony Dixon was born in New Zealand in 1968. His mother was a devout Jehovah's Witness who often provided housing for unmedicated psychiatric patients in the family home. She believed that with enough prayer, their ailments would disappear. As a parent, she was an extreme authoritarian. When her children misbehaved, she would tie them to the washing line or lock them inside the toilet for hours, like a brutal timeout. His father didn't stay involved, and his mother's behaviour became increasingly ruthless. 2 years later, Anthony was removed from her care. This could have been the start of a new chapter for Anthony, but he spent the rest of his youth passing from home to home as a pawn in the broken foster care system. By the time he aged out, the foundations of his violent and troubled future had already been laid. These experiences in his formative years profoundly impacted Anthony's psychological development. The lack of consistent, nurturing care and the exposure to mental health issues without proper intervention likely contributed to his deep-seated emotional and behavioural problems. As he moved through the foster care system, he struggled with authority and showed signs of aggressive behaviour, especially towards women. Alongside the emotional instability, Anthony was also deeply paranoid, even as a teenager. To escape the reality of his tumultuous life and the mental turmoil he endured, he increasingly turned to drugs. His preferred poison was methamphetamine. This choice only fueled his paranoia and distanced him further from reality. At age 19, Anthony met and married Wendy Ross, and the couple would have 2 children together. But domestic life didn't provide the stability or peace one might hope for. Anthony's unresolved paranoia and escalating drug use permeated every aspect of their lives. At times he made his wife communicate with him by writing, as he feared his phone was tapped and their house was bugged. They would take separate cars to social events in case he became suspicious of someone in the group and needed to get away quickly. At home, he would rant about demons and being chosen by God. In one incident, Wendy came home to find him trying to cut out a tracking device he believed had been implanted into his knee. As Anthony's episodes became increasingly violent and frequent, Wendy grew fearful for her own safety and that of her children. She tried to convince her husband to get help, but he never saw his behaviour as a problem. Even after being arrested several times, Anthony refused to change. We know now that the trauma of his childhood had changed how his brain processed the world around him. He couldn't have changed, even if he wanted to. But in many ways, Wendy still loved him and hoped that a different future was possible. But in the end, she had to face facts. Choosing to stay with Anthony was choosing violence, not only for her, but their children as well. But when she finally made the brave decision to leave, he hunted her down and dragged her back to their home. After that, she realized the only way to escape his hold over her life was to go somewhere Anthony couldn't follow her, and she left New Zealand for good. Fast forward to 2002, when Anthony crossed paths with Renee. By then he had 160 convictions for theft and dishonesty, with many of them including some aspect of violence or drug use. But Renee saw past all of that. She too had experienced dysfunction and instability, and in Anthony she saw a kindred soul and a person she could relate to. When they first met, Anthony was in a relationship with her childhood friend Simone Butler, but he was shaping up to be her saviour. He was the person who would finally rescue her from a drug-fueled and violent relationship and take her away for a fresh start. Anthony knew Renee wanted out of her relationship, and he offered for her and Simone to come and live at his place. His place was a converted shed on the back of a friend's property in the small community of Papiroa in the Waikato region of New Zealand. Renee didn't think twice. It was a chance to escape her violent relationship, and with her bestie at her side, what could possibly go wrong? It turns out that everything that could go wrong was about to. From the second she stepped foot into the shed, it was nothing like the escape she had imagined. She hadn't pictured a mega mansion filled with butlers and designer furniture, but she also hadn't pictured a room in the back of a car repair workshop, complete with barred windows and graffiti-covered walls. The warehouse also came complete with surveillance cameras, double-bolted doors, and a room filled with assorted weapons. It was an unusually high level of security for what she had believed was a simple shed. According to Renee, on that first day, Anthony picked up a gun and fired it next to her head, shooting out a window behind her. It was an ominous warning of what her life was about to turn into. Soon after that incident, Simone told Renee that the relationship with Anthony was over. She was done with his weird behaviour and living in the freezing cold accommodations. If Renee had read between the lines, or if Simone had told her best friend exactly what it was like to be apparently loved by Anthony, maybe she would have left right then. But instead, Simone told Renee that she was welcome to him if she wanted. Renee was initially reluctant to get into another relationship, given how badly she had been treated by her last partner. But over time, the chemistry between the pair grew, and they made it official. At first, things between the couple were just as you would expect for a fresh romance. Well, a fresh romance where one partner thinks it's crack up to shoot a gun right next to their loved one's head on the day they move in together. But anyway, at first Anthony was affectionate and loving. When Renee was cold, he would offer a jacket for her to wear, and when she needed reassurance, he would pull her in for a hug. But the honeymoon period was short-lived. Once Renee was under his spell and isolated from her friends, she became the sounding board for Anthony's drug-fueled rants. He told her that he was under surveillance by the police, and there were agents following him every day. Whenever a plane flew overhead, he would tell Renee that the police had aircraft tracking his every movement. And then there was the violence. At first it was a hit or a slap in the middle of a fight, but then it became vicious beatings, which Anthony would apologize for and blame on the drugs. By the time it got to that point, Renee felt like she had no choice but to stay. What she didn't realize was that Anthony was using a classic power and control technique to stop her from leaving him. He was systematic in the way he progressively isolated her from her friends and made her question herself. He monitored her phone calls and text messages and even stated to a friend, quote, "I don't let Renee out of my sight for her own safety." It's the sentiment behind this kind of comment which is typical of a controlling relationship, where one partner seeks to justify their overbearing actions as a form of protection or care. This often stems from possessive or insecure feelings, leading the controlling partner to exert power over the other to undermine their independence and self-esteem. This creates an imbalance of power in the relationship. The controlled partner may start to feel isolated, helpless, or even trapped, which severely impacts their mental and emotional well-being. It also makes them feel like they have no choice but to stay, and that's how it was for Renee. Outside of the fact that Anthony controlled her every move, he had also given her an ultimatum. If she left, he would not only hurt her, he would go after her entire family, and she had every reason to believe that he would follow through on the threat. In the early weeks of January 2003, things between Renee and Anthony had deteriorated to the point where she was living in fear every single day. There were many times where she hoped that she would be rescued once again. that someone would come in and swoop her up out of the shed and take her far away. She even began to wish for the police to be called and for Anthony to be taken to jail. But she dared not do it herself, for fear of him hurting those she loved the most. But before Renee was able to escape, things were going to get much, much worse. On the 20th of January 2003, Renee turned up at her mother's house with Anthony unexpectedly. She said she needed to find a counsellor who could help him because he had been ranting about Allah sending him messages while he was in the bath. At the same time, she accused her mum of narking to the cops about Anthony. Renee's mum didn't know what to make of the situation. She could tell that something was very wrong between the couple, but Renee kept avoiding her questions about it. Finally, she convinced Renee to drive with her to pick up a vehicle from a friend. At first, Anthony didn't want to let Renee out of his sight, but finally she was able to calm him down enough to convince him they would only be gone for a couple of minutes. But as soon as they pulled out of the driveway, Anthony began following them in his Subaru station wagon. When they turned at a set of lights which went red before he made it, he ran the red and began weaving through the traffic with his lights flashing. Renee's mum pulled over in an attempt to de-escalate the situation, but he refused to calm down until Renee was in the car with him. Her mum begged her not to go. Quote, "I told her I felt she was going to die. It was just a feeling I had. She laughed and told me not to be so silly." Renee's mum was about to find out that this deep-seated fear was actually a premonition. The next day was the 21st of January 2003. Renee woke up to find Anthony in another of his wild and ranting states. He spoke again about receiving messages from Allah while he was in the bath. Renee tried to calm him down, but nothing she said made any difference. If anything, he got more and more agitated as the morning went on. Things took a terrible turn when Anthony picked up a hammer from the workshop and began swinging it towards Renee. She raised an arm above her head in self-defense, but it was no match for the force of his blow. The hammer shattered her forearm and forced the fractured fragments of bone up through her skin. In the midst of her agony, she didn't scream or cry. She knew that would only aggravate her attacker further. Instead, she continued to try and calm Anthony down. She grabbed a towel and tried to stop the bleeding, and begged Anthony to let her go for help. But he refused, so she retreated to a corner and stayed silent. Remember, this is while she has literal bone sticking out of her arm. At around 7 p.m, Simone dropped by with a friend. She was immediately confronted by Anthony, who accused her of trying to poison him and of sleeping with a police officer. When he grabbed a samurai sword, Simone knew it was over. Anthony told her to get onto her knees and bow her head so he could chop it off. Simone refused his demands, which sent him into even more of a psychotic rage. He began swinging the sword around wildly, attacking both of the women. In the end, Renee was left lying in a pool of her own blood. She had been scalped, her throat had been cut, and one of her hands was completely severed from her arm. Next to her, Simone was in a similar state, with both of her hands nearly completely severed. They might have bled to death, except that for some unknown reason, Anthony called 111 and told officers that someone had fallen off a roof. Then he fled in a vehicle, leaving both women fighting for their lives. Renee and Simone were airlifted to hospital where they were rushed into surgery. Renee underwent a 6-hour surgery in an attempt to reattach her severed hand. The surgery was unsuccessful. Simone survived the attack, and her left hand was successfully reattached in a marathon 14-hour surgery. However, her right hand was cut in half and unable to be saved. Meanwhile, Anthony was still on the warpath. He drove 120 kilometres or 75 miles to Auckland, where he came across James Te Aute in the car park of a shopping mall. James was a father of 3 young kids and unknown to the man who would become his killer. According to witnesses, Anthony and James exchanged words across the parking lot. As James turned to walk away, Anthony shot him 10 times in the back with a submachine gun. A nearby shop owner called the police, and the armed offender squad arrived a few minutes later. By then, Anthony was long gone, and James was dead. Over the coming hours, officers were able to use the description of the vehicle to track Anthony to a rural road in a nearby suburb. At around 1 a.m, they followed him to a home where he forced his way inside and took a man and a woman hostage. Negotiators attempted to reason with him, and a few hours later, the woman was able to escape unharmed. At one point, Anthony made his intentions behind the attack on Renee and Simone explicitly clear when he stated, quote, "I would have killed them if the sword hadn't broken. I'm going to kill myself. You'll be the only one at my funeral. It's going to be another Ara Moana. I'll go out in a blaze of glory. Suicide by cop. The armed offender squad better be ready. I'm not going back to jail. It's too late. I'm fried." The Ara Moana incident Anthony was referring to is the tragic mass shooting that occurred in the small coastal settlement of Ara Moana on the 13th of November 1990. This devastating event saw David Gray fatally shoot 13 people, ranging from children to the elderly, over a period of 22 hours. The massacre was only brought to an end when the police special tactics group located and fatally shot the shooter. In other words, death by cop. Anthony's actions leading up to this point made it clear that he was unlikely to give up his position easily. But after several hours of negotiations, he released the hostage and surrendered to the police. He was later found to have been drunk and high on methamphetamine throughout the incident. The following day, Anthony was charged with murder, shooting at police, kidnapping, and aggravated burglary. He pleaded not guilty to all 12 charges on the grounds of insanity. We'll get to the trial in a moment. But first, let's take a look at one of the more unusual and concerning aspects of this case. That is, the control Anthony was able to exert over Renee and Simone after he attempted to take their lives. While Renee and Simone were in hospital recovering, and Anthony was in custody at a psychiatric facility, a bunch of flowers arrived in each of their rooms. Attached was a note, quote, "With love, sorry, Tony." Both women had already given several statements to detectives investigating the case. Each shared how controlling Anthony was, and Renee in particular provided some insight into the fear she lived in every day. Quote, "Right up until the attack, I was living in fear for my life constantly every day, and just hoping that there'd be a chance, a way out, and the police would turn up or something would happen. All I know is that I just did what I was told, and that was about it. I was too scared to say otherwise. I should have stayed in the car with my mum, but you make the wrong decision sometimes, and I suppose I have to pay for that." But when those flowers arrived to Renee's hospital room, everything changed. Her face lit up when she found out who they were from, and she defended Anthony's actions, even his attempt to murder her. She blamed his mental illness and drug addictions for his actions, and tried to assert that he was a good guy underneath all of it. In the following months, their connection only seemed to grow stronger, even through the walls that separated them. The tendrils of Anthony's allure were not easy to escape. Over the coming year, Anthony wrote more than 100 letters to Renee. She received daily phone calls from him, sometimes as many as 45 in one day. She was also photographed by the media, visiting Anthony in prison. And Renee wasn't the only one. Anthony's first wife, Wendy, also told police how she had lived in fear of her life the entire time she was married. She had gone so far as to move overseas to get away from him. And yet she too was seen visiting him in prison, and she quickly agreed to appear as a trial witness in his defense. The woman's feelings towards Anthony could be explained by Stockholm Syndrome. This is when captives or victims are so tightly controlled by their oppressor that they come to view them as a kind of savior. Anyone who is the enemy of their captor is their enemy too. This psychological phenomenon occurs under extreme stress, particularly when victims spend prolonged periods with their captors and face a real threat to their survival. Over time, the victims develop a bond with the person who is controlling their lives. They might even experience empathy for them or misinterpret a lack of abuse as an act of kindness. When the trial got underway in 2005, Anthony was often photographed in court with an odd mushroom haircut and large wild eyes which he would roll repeatedly. It was clear to anyone watching that he was attempting to convince the jury that he was as insane as his plea. Photos of Anthony circulated widely in New Zealand news media and became what we might call a meme these days. On the witness stand, his ex-wife Wendy described how it only took a couple of months for her to realise Anthony was dangerous. When he was in one of his moods, he appeared to be possessed, but then she said he was a great dad and charming, generous, talented, and with a, quote, contagious personality. Renee had also agreed to appear in Anthony's defence, but she was never called as a witness. Turns out that in the letters he was sending her, he had been coaching her on what to say in court. This made her testimony unreliable. After 17 hours of deliberation, the jury found Anthony guilty of mutilating the women, but in a shocking twist, he was acquitted of their attempted murder. Apparently, chasing after someone, attacking them with a samurai sword, is not enough to prove you want to kill them. In total, he was found guilty of 8 of 12 charges, including the murder of James. For his crimes, Anthony was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 20 years. He also received 12 years for each of 2 charges of wounding Simone and Renee with intent, 8 years for kidnapping the hostage during the police standoff, 5 years for shooting at 2 policemen, 4 years for shooting at another policeman, and 5 years for aggravated burglary. Anthony immediately appealed the conviction and his sentencing by arguing that the trial judge did not properly instruct the jury on the law relating to insanity. Secondly, he claimed that he should have been able to be found guilty of manslaughter rather than murder. On the 7th of September 2007, the Court of Appeal agreed and they overturned his convictions and ordered a new trial. The second trial got underway in June 2008, but right before it was set to begin, Anthony attacked a fellow inmate and attempted to gouge his eyes out with a fork. At his second trial, Anthony took to the stand in his own defence. He detailed a childhood filled with extreme physical punishments. At times he was chained to a fence, which is when he says he developed the ability to communicate telepathically with dogs. Quote, I understood from a young age that was my role in life, to be ridiculed or persecuted. He also claims to have heard the voice of God, which was encouraged by his mother. Quote, it was a normal thing in Jehovah's Witness when you hear things. Physical abuse wasn't the only kind of trauma he experienced during childhood. He claims more than 20 people essayed him over the years, including his own mother. Quote, the essay wasn't too bad. There were about 20 people doing it on regular occasions, but there was violence. Anthony's sister backed up these claims and stated that he had been forced to take part in adult movies and photo shoots. The perpetrator of this abuse has since been tried and found guilty of several sex crimes. The abuse triggered a deep sense of paranoia, which stayed with Anthony even as an adult. He believed he was being followed by the police and agents from the government who tracked him in a Boeing aircraft and through devices which they implanted in his skin. At the conclusion of the second trial, Anthony was found guilty of the same charges as he was initially convicted. His sentencing hearing was set for the 5th of February 2009. In the meantime, he met with his lawyer in prison. During one of these interviews, he pulled a shank on the lawyer and attempted to stab him. Prison staff were able to intervene before any injuries were caused, but the lawyer refused to press charges against his client. The lawyer later denied that any attack had even taken place. At 10:30 p.m. on the 4th of February 2009, just one day before the resentencing hearing, Anthony was found deceased in his cell. A subsequent investigation found that Anthony died of injuries he gave himself. In the wake of his death, a coroner's report was commissioned, which found that Anthony had been visited by a psychiatrist just hours before his death. The medical report stated he was unwell, but appropriately provided for in custody. Hours later, he was dead. The coroner's report described how an officer had heard a thud from Anthony's cell and gone to investigate. Through the window, he could see that Anthony was naked and bleeding and had a cloth cord from his gown tied around his neck. The officer called for backup, which took 7 minutes to arrive. Anthony was considered extremely high risk of self-harm, but also very high risk of injuring prison officers, so his room couldn't be unlocked until at least 4 staff were there to enter his cell together. By then, it was already too late. The report noted that methamphetamine was found in Anthony's blood at the time of his death, indicating he had access to the drugs whilst incarcerated. In the wake of Anthony's drug-fueled rampage, victims' rights advocates campaigned for law changes which would see strangulation be considered its own distinct crime. This movement highlighted strangulation as an act of violence and emphasized its potential as a precursor to more severe assaults or even homicide. Strangulation in intimate partner violence is a significant predictor of future lethal violence. Research indicates that victims who have been non-fatally strangled by their partners are about 750% more likely to be killed by them. Several of Anthony's previous partners, including Wendy, Simone, and Renee, reported he had strangled them at least once during their relationship. Anthony is survived by 9 children to several different women. At least one of his sons has been charged with dealing P, the same drug which fueled his father in his violent rampage. In the years since the attack, Simone has become a domestic violence campaigner. She also wrote a book about her experience titled Double-Edged Sword. Renee hasn't fared so well. In 2017, she was arrested for her part in a methamphetamine ring and was sentenced to 5 years and 7 months in prison. Anthony Dixon's story provides us with a chilling insight into the lifelong effects of trauma which occurs during childhood. While his experiences don't excuse his future actions, they do go some way to helping us understand how a child's brain is affected in ways which may not be clear for many years. For Anthony, the signs of his deteriorating mental health were there long before he was arrested for murder. Maybe if the law had taken his early crimes more seriously and provided the support he so desperately needed, an innocent father wouldn't have lost his life, and 2 women wouldn't have to live with the effects of long-term disabilities. And that's not even mentioning the mental impact on his victims. The lesson in this story is to continue the fight for deeper societal and systemic changes when it comes to intimate partner violence. By recognizing and addressing early indicators of trauma and providing necessary support, we might be able to prevent future tragedies.